Hello Revies, and welcome back to our study of the Russian Revolution. This video is going to look at the Bolsheviks' early decrees and policies, and they passed numerous decrees when they got into power from October 27th, 1917 onwards. This video will look at 5 of those decrees. If you do wish to, for your own interest, see all of the different decrees that they did pass during the early months of their reign, then please go to Marxists.org, and I will go there now and show you the long list of those decrees. So there they are there from October 25th, October 26th and onwards, numerous decrees. So for the purposes of the end of year exam, you do not need to know the ins and outs of each of those decrees, but having some understanding of at least the most significant ones will help flesh out your answers in the exam and get you those high marks that you want. So anyway, let's go back to the presentation and we'll begin with our study. Okay, so the first image here we have is of Lenin announcing the overthrow of the Provisional Government and the creation of the Soviet government at the Second All Congress of Soviets on the 27th of October 1917. A very famous painting, and I thought it was appropriate to use as our focus point for this presentation. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, the Bolsheviks' early decrees, and here are the 5 we are going to look at. So, we're going to look at the Decree on Workers' Control, the Decree on Land, the Decree on Peace, the establishment of Vesenkha, and then also the establishment of the Cheka. And then at the end we'll look at some historical interpretations which you will need to include in your responses to exam questions. The Decree on Workers' Control. So there is your key date there, the 27th of November 1917. That's when it was passed. And that's the new dating system. The old dating system is the 14th of November 1917. I've included both dates there, just in case you need them. So the key points. So this decree accepted the workers' takeover of the factories that happened prior to and during October 1917. So the workers literally took over the factories and ran them themselves. And you would think also gained the profits from whatever they sold and so forth. The decree also instructed workers' committees to maintain the strictest order and discipline in the workplace. So the Bolsheviks were aware that they needed, fully aware that the economy still needed to run, that the factories still needed to produce the products in order for society to run effectively. Steel, cars, whatever. And then the third key point here, it contributed to, the Decree on Workers' Control contributed to retaining the loyalty of the proletariat during the Civil War. So this Decree on Workers' Control, it gave to the workers what they wanted. Control over the factories and to gain profits from their labour, total profit from the work that they did in those factories, rather than part of their labour going to the bosses and so forth, and the bosses or the capitalists making money off their labour. Now at the bottom there I've got a key quote from the Decree on Workers' Control, and you can see the source there, it's Marxists.org. So if you wish to read the Decree on Workers' Control in its entirety, then go to the URL there, it's all there. So the key quote: Workers' control is introduced in all industrial, commercial, agricultural and similar enterprises. This control is to extend over the production, storing, buying and selling of raw materials and finished products as well as over the finances of the enterprise. So the workers themselves controlled all of that, and they gained the profits from all of that, from the production, from the selling of raw materials, the selling of the finished products, and over the finances as well. So they managed it. And I've included here on the side a photo of a Red Guard unit at a factory in Petrograd just prior to the October 1917 revolution. And you can see the composition of these Red Guard units. In the official propaganda, Red Guards depicted as all wearing their red uniforms, and they've got their stars on their caps, and they're all pretty much similar. Here though, you can see many of them have got, some of them have got soldiers' hats on, some of them are just workers, whatever. That's a mix, all right? But what you can see all in common is that they all hold arms, those arms that were given to them after the Kornilov affair by Kerensky in order to defend Petrograd. And as we know, they retained those arms after the Kornilov affair in late August, early September 1917, and then they used those arms to overthrow Kerensky and the Provisional Government under the command or direction of the Petrograd Soviet, which was at that time, by October 1917, in the full control of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Next, the Decree on Land. The Decree on Land was passed on the 8th of November 1917, old date 26th of October 1917, so literally on the eve of the revolution itself. And the key points here, so this is really important. When we look back to how Lenin gained the support of many people in Russia and the peasants in particular, it was through his land policy. And with his land policy, he recognised, and the Bolsheviks recognised, the land seizures that had been occurring in Russia by the peasants seizing land off wealthy landlords, going right back, or beginning in February 1917 and continuing through that entire period from February 1917 right up to October 1917. Lenin recognised that, and once the Bolsheviks get into power through the Petrograd Soviet, this Decree on Land, they pass the Decree on Land and fulfills that promise. He fulfills that promise which he made to the peasants of giving or letting them retain the land that they seized. So this Decree on Land, you see that first point there, approved of, legitimised, legalised the peasant land seizures. The second point, and we're making links to future events, okay? So it contributed to the Bolsheviks retaining the support of the peasants during the Civil War. When we get to our study of the Civil War, we'll see in our study of grain requisitioning and so forth, the Bolsheviks treated the peasants very harshly through their grain requisitioning, where they forcibly took the grain from peasants. They treated the peasants harshly, and the peasants weren't happy about it. There were revolts, but we need to understand, and when we get to the Civil War, we'll see this. The Bolsheviks' enemies, the whites, they were also undertaking grain requisitioning, or forcibly taking the grain from the peasants who they controlled in Russia, or in the occupied areas which they had in Russia. So both the Bolsheviks, who were the Reds, and the anti-Bolshevik forces, who were the Whites, who were made up of a variety of different groups, conservatives, nationalists, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, former Tsarist officers, pretty much all just anti-Bolsheviks. They also treated the peasants harshly, but the difference was that the Bolsheviks had promised or had passed this Decree on Land. So when the Civil War ended, the Bolsheviks could claim that the peasants would retain the land once the hostilities had ended. The whites, however, many of the white generals, they wanted to return Russia to the way things used to be, where the peasants would lose all of that land that they seized, and because these white generals were not prepared to recognise the land seizures, they did not retain the support of the peasants as much as the Bolsheviks did with their decree on land. The key quote there, and this is from the decree on land: "Private ownership of land shall be abolished forever. Land shall not be sold, purchased, leased, mortgaged, or otherwise alienated." And then I have included here just a photo of some Russian peasants. The ground is very muddy, as you can see, but you get an idea of what their lifestyle was like at that time. Okay, next, the decree on peace. The decree on peace, like the decree on land, was passed on the 26th of October 1917. The key points were it demanded negotiations to begin between the warring nations to end the war. So we're talking about ending World War I. And this goes right back to the Bolshevik slogan, "Peace, bread and land." And the Bolsheviks, from the start of the war, and they were the only revolutionary party, only group who were not supportive of Russia's involvement in the war. And when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, in his April theses, he refers to and demands the end to the war again. By 1917, many people had had enough of the war, and he was making the promise in the April theses to end the war, and he's fulfilling that promise through this decree on peace. So, demanding an end to the war, starting negotiations with the other warring nations. In Russia's case, that's Germany. So, negotiating with Germany to pull Russia out of the war. And when we look at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolsheviks do fulfill that promise. They do sign a peace treaty with the Germans. Very, very harsh terms, though, for the Russians. They lose pretty much all of the Ukraine and various other things, but they do make peace. So they do fulfill their promise of bringing peace to the Russian people, of pulling Russia out of World War I by March 1918. I remind you, or you should be aware, that World War I continues right on till November 1918, okay, with the other warring nations, but Russia's out of it by March 1918. The second key point here, the decree on peace demanded all land conquered. So land that's conquered by another nation, the word here in the actual document is called annexed, by the warring nation be returned, nor indemnities paid. And indemnities are payments which a defeated nation pays to a victorious nation to cover the costs of a war. Those of you who studied the Treaty of Versailles would have some understanding of these annexations and indemnities. And in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany did lose much of its land. It was conquered by the French and the British, or some of it was removed and given to other nations to the east, such as Poland, and Germany was also forced to pay indemnities to the victorious nations, Britain and France. Okay? So, and here is the key quote here, the Decree on Peace. The Workers' and Peasants' Government, created by the Revolution of October 24-25, calls upon all the belligerent peoples, so the warring peoples and their government, to start immediate negotiations for a just, democratic peace. By such a peace, the government means an immediate peace without annexations. So the borders go back to what they were. Russia retains its old borders prior to World War I. Same with the British, same with the French, same with the Germans, etc. Without the seizure of foreign lands, without the forcible incorporation of foreign nations, and without indemnities, and they're those war payments which the losing nations or nations paid to the victors. And this is once again from Marxist.org. And this image here is of Russian soldiers, October 1917. So I think this is just prior to the revolution. But it's interesting, I did it here because you have Russian soldiers holding a communism flag. So even by then, they're supporting this idea of a communist state. Very nice piece of primary source evidence here, okay? That indicates that soldiers were supporters of a communist state in October 1917. Next, let's go to Vesenkha. So Vesenkha was the Supreme Council of a National Economy. It was set up with the decree on the 14th of December 1917. That's according to the new calendar, or 1st of December 1917 according to the old dates. The key points. So it was set up to take economic control over the major public and private enterprises in Russia. And the key term here is nationalised. So it was the government department, the department within Sovnarkom, the communist government, Bolshevik government, Sovnarkom, that was in control of or directed the nationalisation of various both public and private enterprises in Russia. Banks, steel mills, the railway system, all of that. So its early achievements, and that's our second point, links in there. Early achievements, the banks and the railways were nationalised, and nationalised means government owned. Foreign debts were cancelled. So this is a really interesting point here. Both the Tsarist government and the provisional government which followed, they were taking loans out from the British and the French. The British and the French were pretty much bankrolling the provisional government in order to keep Russia in the war. And that's why the provisional government was so loath to pull out. One of the reasons why it was so loath to pull out of the war, did not want to pull out of the war, was because it was being funded, partially at least, by the British and the French through these loans. Okay? When the Bolsheviks got into power, those loans still existed, but the Bolsheviks said, well, we didn't take them out, so we are not going to recognise them. So they cancelled all these loans. The British and the French lost all their money, and one of the reasons why the British and the French get involved in the Civil War and support the whites is because they wanted to try to regain that money which they had lost because of the Bolsheviks. And the transport system was made less chaotic. So that's a huge point. A huge achievement for the Bolsheviks. If you remember back to what we learned about World War One, particularly under the Tsarist regime, and how the transport system had all pretty much collapsed because of mismanagement, and as a consequence, food was not getting to the front nor to Petrograd or Moscow as efficiently as it could have. So the Bolsheviks improved the railway system. So these were the aim of Vesenkha was, to take control over pretty much all economic enterprise in Russia. However, this third point here, even though they set up Vesenkha, the Bolsheviks, Vesenkha itself couldn't fully achieve all of its aims because the Bolsheviks didn't have the power to do that. Initially, Bolshevik control did not extend far beyond Petrograd and Moscow. After the Civil War, it extended, throughout all of Russia, and during the Civil War, it extended more and more. But initially, it was quite limited. Vesenkha's power and authority to impact upon the economic life of Russia. Here is a key quote here, and this is from the decree setting up Vesenkha. The Supreme Council of National Economy has the right to confiscate, so take away, requisition, sequester, and consolidate various branches of industry, commerce, and other enterprises in the field of production, distribution, and state finance. It is to take charge of all existing institutions for the regulation of the economic life and has the right to reorganise them. So, private and public, all businesses, the Bolsheviks are saying, Vesenkha now has control over and can do with what it will. Okay? And that, once again, is from Marxist.org. The image up here is of the State Bank of Russia. in St. Petersburg, 1905. Under the Bolsheviks, you can see the little caption there, it became the People's Bank. And then when Stalin came into power, it was renamed again. But that was a public bank. Other private banks were pretty much either, well, they were made public as well, and some of them would have been consolidated into the People's Bank. Okay, finally, the fifth measure or decree is the establishment of the Cheka. So the Cheka, that's its short name. Its long name is the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Fighting Counter-Revolution, Sabotage and Speculation. Counter-revolution is the act of trying to overthrow revolutionaries who get into power. So counter-revolutionaries in this context, the Russian Revolution, are people who wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks, remove them from power. Okay, and there were many. We'll see the SRs wanted to get rid of the Bolsheviks, so did the Mensheviks eventually, so did all of the other white forces. Sabotage is blowing up things or destroying things, government offices, and I'm sure that also includes assassination. And speculation is making money or making too high a profit from trade and so forth, speculating, just trading things in order to make a profit. And that can impact, for instance, from a communist viewpoint, speculation can increase the price of food so that it becomes too expensive for the average person to actually buy enough to feed themselves and their family. The key date here was created on December 1917, and its purpose, the first point, was to destroy counter-revolutionaries. And this was a very broad term that included class enemies and members of other revolutionary or political groups. So, class enemies, when we're talking about class enemies, the good classes are the workers and the peasants. Their class enemies are the capitalists, okay, or the nobility, etc. Members of other revolutionary or political groups, well, that's all the other revolutionary groups. So if you're talking, as we said, Mensheviks, SRs, political groups could be your liberals, your cadets, your Octoberists, conservatives, nationalists, and so forth. The Cheka had unlimited powers of arrest, detention, and torture, and the organisation itself aided the Bolsheviks in consolidating and defending their political authority in Russia. Without the Cheka, the Bolsheviks would have been overthrown. Before the Civil War, they consolidate and protect the Bolsheviks. During the Civil War, they play a very key role. So during the Civil War, they're involved in the Red Terror. And the Red Terror itself had both political and economic aspects. The economic aspects being war communism, and a part of war communism was this grain requisitioning, which I referred to previously in the decree on land. So forcibly taking grain from peasants during the Civil War. So the Cheka manned these sort of grain detachments who went out to villages, and they forcibly took grain from peasants in order to feed the army, the Red Army, and the citizens in the cities. The other aspect of the Red Terror was the political aspect and the executing of political opponents. Perhaps the most famous of those was the Tsar and his family in July 1918. They also ran labour camps to incarcerate enemies of the revolution. Our class enemies up here, anyone who's anti-Bolshevik pretty much, probably the easiest term to describe those who were trying to overthrow the Bolsheviks. And there were 315 of these labour camps by the time Lenin died in 1924. I've got two quotes here. I included two quotes. The first is from the actual decree that set up the Cheka, and the second one is Dzerzhinsky, but we'll go through the decree quote first. So, the duties of the commission will be, and this is very enlightening, to persecute and break up all acts of counter-revolution and sabotage all over Russia, no matter what their origin, to bring before the Revolutionary Tribunal all counter-revolutionists and saboteurs, and to work out a plan for fighting them. The commission is to watch the press, so the newspapers, saboteurs, strikers, which is interesting. Strikers are workers. So, the workers are the supporters of the revolution, the supporters of the Bolsheviks. But the Cheka's role is to actually persecute and imprison workers who decide to strike because of poor conditions, etc. And confinement. Strikers and the socialist revolutionists of the right. I remind you, at this early stage, December 1917, the left SRs were supporters of the Bolsheviks, and they were part of the Sugnarkum and supported the Bolsheviks. The left SRs only get outlawed by the Bolsheviks as a consequence of their stand, I believe, their opposition to Lenin signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but we'll get to that. And then measures to be taken against these counter-revolutionists are confiscation, so confiscation of their property, what they owned, confinement, imprisonment, deprivation of food cards, so there was food rationing, and the Cheka would take those cards, and yes, those people would starve. And publication of the names of the enemies of the people, so people who were who tried to resist the Bolsheviks, the Cheka would publish their names in newspapers as criminals of the state. And this is from the decree on establishment of the Extraordinary Commission to Fight Counter-Revolution, and it's once again from Marxist.org. All of that, and I think we'll just go back to this second point here. So the Cheka had unlimited powers of arrest, detention and torture. So they were judge, jury and executioner, all rolled into one. And Dzerzhinsky, and here's the photo of Dzerzhinsky up here. He was originally a Polish nobleman, or from noble origins, and he hated the nobility, and he was a fervent supporter of Lenin, and totally loyal, fanatical Bolshevik, totally loyal to Lenin, and Lenin put him in charge of the Cheka. And this is one of his classic quotes, which gives you a real insight to the way he thought. Do not demand evidence to prove that the prisoner has opposed the Soviet government. Your first duty is to ask him to which class he belongs, what are his origins. These questions should decide the fate of the prisoner. So what he is saying there is, if they have a prisoner and the prisoner says they are a capitalist, then they are a class enemy and they will be persecuted. They must oppose the Soviet government, so they'll be persecuted by the Cheka. Okay. And then finally, our historical interpretations. There we are, historical interpretations. So I've just included two here. You can find more in your studies, I'm sure, but I thought these were quite appropriate for these early decrees. So the first one is from the HCPSU, and the HCPSU, if you don't know, is the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and that can be accessed in its entirety at Marxist.org as well. And this is their view of these early decrees and the reasons why the Bolsheviks passed these decrees. In order to put an end to the survivals of feudalism, the estate system, and equality in all spheres of social life, decrees were issued abolishing the estates, removing restrictions based on nationality or religion, separating the church from the state and the schools from the church, establishing equality for women and the equality of all the nationalities of Russia. So from the perspective of the HCPSU, the Bolsheviks with these decrees ended inequality, removed economic inequality or religious inequality and so forth, and gender inequality, and through these decrees made everyone equal in Russia. So that is the viewpoint of the HCPSU, the official state history written during Stalin's time, okay, about the revolution. And then you have this contrasting view here from Richard Pipes. The communist regime was a monumental failure. It succeeded in only one thing only, staying in power. And that I got that from Ian Lyle, who wrote the Russian Revolution Study and Exam Guide, and here's again. So if you haven't got a copy of that text, please do get your hands on it. It's very, very useful for the end of year exam. So that is our look at the Bolsheviks' early decrees, and hopefully it has been of use to you. Good luck.